Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. It is June 17th, 2024, from Lexington, Kentucky. How do we know what we know about turfgrass science? That's what we're here to figure out. And today we're going over fertilizers and raw materials and fertilizer ratios, formulations, blending. I have a tremendous amount of information to go through today. This is the members-only live stream. It'll be loaded to the public in a few days or so after the podcast is released, is usually when I open this up to the public. But welcome to the members today. Chuck and Mark, good to see you. There is a lot to go over today. I'm just going to try to get into it as quick as I can. I almost waited and tried to do some of this on Thursday night, but I got to get it in at some point, and then we'll see what happens if I get through it all. But there's a lot. Real quick before I forget is that Google Podcasts, for some reason, decided to change how they do things. I don't really know why. And maybe it's me on my end. Maybe I'm not doing it correctly. But what was happening was the day after this is broadcast live, I load it to the podcast, and Google's RSS feed that goes to Google loads it to YouTube as a podcast. But what happens is it gets loaded as a video, even though it's a podcast. And it was confusing a lot of people. People were emailing me and saying, hey, there's no video on this video, and the slides aren't working on this video. When it's not a video, it's the podcast version of the live stream that Google uses. It's just confusing. I don't know why they did that. But I'm saying all that to say this. The podcast viewers that use Google Podcasts is less than 1% of the Google listener or the podcast listeners. It's creating all kinds of confusion. So I've just removed Google Podcast as a podcast platform for this podcast. It's available on, I don't know how many other 10 or 20 different podcast platforms. So if you want to listen to it, it's not going anywhere. I mean, it's still available, but Google Podcast has sort of screwed up the system, or I screwed up the system or something, and it's just very confusing. So you won't see any more Google Podcasts or video. It shows up as a video. I don't know why they showed up as a video. Anyway, you won't see that anymore on my channel, at least for a while, until Google figures out how to allow the podcast to be loaded as just an audio-only stream, and it differentiates itself from a standalone video. That's all I had. I'm going to get into it. So we're going over fertilizer raw materials and ratios today, and we're going to go over at the end the formulation, how you would formulate things with raw materials that contain more than one nutrient. The last two fertilizer episodes, if you listen back to those, I've been going over fertilizer materials, and the intent is to help you enhance your knowledge or provide you with the knowledge and the tools to formulate your fertilizer, your granular fertilizer by yourself, and in so doing result in a more efficient fertilizer for your program, whether you're in golf or saw production or lawn care, whatever the case is, sport turf, whatever your industry you're in. If you're able to blend it yourself and understand how to make it yourself and order it using the batch sheet approach, you'll know exactly what's in it, and you'll understand what you're buying and the value of the raw materials that are in the blend. Okay, that's what we've been going over, and it's a stepwise learning method. If you haven't listened to the previous two episodes or previous 2 or 3 episodes, I encourage you to go back and listen to those first, because this one is this. There's a lot of information here that stands alone. The first 30, 40 minutes I'm going to go over is just all information that is very useful and helps you understand why you would want to include a raw material or not. But at the end, we're going to go over formulation that is rather complicated. It gets more complicated, and it requires you to have at least attempted or understand the process from the prior 2 or 3 podcasts about how to formulate the basics of formulation. Okay, so let's get into it, because I don't want to be here all day, which very well could be. There's a lot to go into today. Okay, fertilizer raw materials and ratios. At the end of this section, you will be able to understand which raw materials you should consider and why. Understand which fertilizer ratios you should use and why. Okay? This is an epistemological I don't know, or thought process is that I do care about what you're doing in turf management, but epistemologically, I'm more interested in why you're doing it. What is important? No question about it. But why is the more important question? Do you have a good reason? Okay, and that's why I put this in here at the beginning, is that not only will you understand which fertilizer ratios you should use, but you'll understand why you should be considering these. You'll be able to develop a good reason or understand whether or not you do have a good reason or not, right? So that's sort of the approach to this. Yeah, so Mark F asked a question in chat. So let me ask this question live and then do my best to answer it. He says, so I take it that when you buy commercial products, one never has access to the build sheet, or the batch sheet is what he's saying, and have no clue how much filler is in it or not. Correct. That is correct. The vast majority of cases, actually, I've never actually seen a fertilizer. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Someone can probably prove me wrong. I've never seen a fertilizer sold that contains the batch sheet formula on it, meaning it lists every single component that's in the fertilizer, whether it's actually a nutrient or not, or derived from component that makes up the nutritional guaranteed analysis or not. Okay, there's all sorts of other things that can go in it that may not contribute agronomically or to the agronomic value of the product. So there is no build sheet, there is no batch sheet that's provided with the fertilizer that you buy. Okay. But I think maybe on Thursday night, I might start to introduce how to back formulate blends. But I got to get through this section first to kind of explain how to do the multi-nutrient analysis formulation. And then I'll, at the maybe not today for sure, but maybe on Thursday, I'll provide, say, a generic fertilizer. I'll show a tag, and then I'll walk through the process and formulate that particular fertilizer by hand and show you how to do that. And then you'll see exactly, this is how much stuff's in this fertilizer, and this is how much waste or filler or whatever else material's in there. So you'll be able to do that. Well, I'll show you how to do that. It might take some practice to be able to do it on your own, but it can be done in most cases. I would say 90 to 95% of the fertilizers can be formulated from the tag if you know how to do it. Not everyone, but most of them. Okay. So on the screen, I have a normal tag from a 1648 showing 2% iron in minors. It's a turf fertilizer, and it has the guaranteed analysis and ingredients and so forth. And this is what I was talking about. Let's see if I can get my whoops. There it is. Okay, let me get my little pen out. So this is what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about this ratio. That's what we're going to be talking about. This 1648 is the ratio. And then the raw materials is what's over here, ingredients, and oftentimes you'll see it referred to as derived from components. Diammonium phosphate, for example, urea. These are the raw materials that are in this particular blend, but it doesn't necessarily mean everything in this blend is on this list. I think that's what you're asking, Mark. So that definitely is not normal to have everything on that fertilizer, in the fertilizer on the tag. Okay, when formulating for efficiency, we must ask, does the material benefit the turf? And then how much does that benefit cost? If you're not going to if you're not going to blend for efficiency, then this doesn't pertain to you. Okay. We want to make a fertilizer that is the most efficient economically and hopefully environmentally, and usually they line up. But what is the most economically efficient product? So if this goes for all industries. If you're in golf and sport turf or lawn care or saw production or whatever, we want to get the most efficient product we can, meaning the most bang for our buck. Okay. And so does the material benefit the turf, and how much does that benefit cost? That's what we want to ask. We will be discussing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium today, as well as other nutritional components. So for N, P, and K, here we go. How is the cost of nitrogen sources fairly compared? All right. This is really for everybody, but primarily the hanging point on this particular slide is a result of interactions primarily with lawn care operators. Because lawn care operators generally will look at the price of fertilizer differently than some, say, superintendents or sod producers. And that is, they usually look at the price per bag, okay? So, or the price per ton. The price per ton and price per bag is the same. It's analogous. This is not a very good way to consider how much does my fertilizer cost. The analysis of the ton varies, the analysis in the bag varies, the contents in the bag vary. It could be an infinite combination of raw materials and essentially almost an infinite number of guaranteed analyses on that ton. So if you look at the price per bag or the price per ton, that's not a very effective or efficient way of pricing fertilizer. And when you compare it on the price per pound of nitrogen, that is a little bit better for sure. This is at the end of the day, we're going to end up relying upon this just because of the simplicity, and the difference between this and the next method is so slight. It's almost not even worth bothering with the next method because it's almost always the same as the price per pound of N. So this is probably what we should lean on most when it comes to determining how should we compare costs of fertilizer. This is a better method. Nitrogen drives turf growth. So this seems fair, but N sources do vary. Ammonium sulfate has the same pounds of nitrogen, or 2100, all ammonium sulfate has the same pounds as nitrogen as a 2100 all polymer-coated urea. You can make a polymer-coated urea fertilizer, 100% polymer-coated urea, be a 2100 if you just add enough filler to it. Okay, or you add other components to it. You add nitrogen or potassium or something else, magnesium or iron or whatever. You add something else in the fertilizer. It can still say a 21% nitrogen. One of them's coming from 100% ammonium sulfate, and one of them's coming from 100% polymer-coated urea. Okay, so the price per pound of N is a much, much better method than price per ton. But there can be other things that need to be accounted for, such as the difference in turf response from these various nitrogen sources. So, the cost per day of acceptable turf, is it the best method? It probably is the best method, but to get that value and that number is so painstakingly difficult. I don't know if it's really pragmatic to use that approach, but it probably is the best, most accurate method. How much does it actually cost to produce turf grass per day? This method uses longevity and turf response and then accounts for how much that response costs. The problem is, we don't have a whole lot of data on that. There's exactly one paper in the scientific literature that even approaches that question. And it was on one type of turf grass in 2 locations. So there's the evidence supporting that approach is not particularly robust, but there is a little bit there in the literature. Okay. So nitrogen sources. I talked about the fertilizers can have different types of nitrogen in it. You can have urea, ammonium sulfate, calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate. All these have they're all different forms of soluble nitrogen, and they all can react differently in the soil, and they can result in higher pH or lower pH or no effect on pH or increases in sodium, which may not be desirable. In most cases, it's not desirable. There's all sorts of different things that can happen in soluble nitrogen sources. Then there's coated and reacted products like sulfur coat or polymer coat, and there's dozens of brands of these different coated materials. There's also reacted nitrogen sources like UF and urea formaldehyde, methylene urea, and IBDU. These are all reacted products as well. These are slow-release coated or reacted nitrogen sources that can be in your fertilizer. And then there's a whole group of natural organics like biosolids, bone meal, feather meal, blood meal, chicken meal, and guano. So in other words, the point in this slide is that there's all sorts of different nitrogen sources that can be in that fertilizer. And if all you do is look at the price per bag and you don't consider the nitrogen source in it or the other raw materials in it, you're not doing yourself any justice, because you might be buying a bag full of, 1970s Pinto, or you might be buying a bag full of 2024 Mercedes. If you're just looking at the bag and you're not looking at what's in it, you're not doing yourself any justice in terms of the efficient use of your funds. So let me answer a question from Chuck Benzing. He says, do I plan to discuss types of filler used in batches of water-soluble blends at some point? There, at the end of the presentation on Thursday night, there is a presentation called Formulating with Filler. I think it's on Thursday night. I might have put it at the end of today's show. I can't remember. but there is a short presentation on formulating with filler. Okay. There are options for different types of filler. And so I will go over that, but very briefly, Chuck. I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth on filler. And when you're talking about water-soluble products, I don't know if you mean water-soluble or if you mean spray grade, but if it's water-soluble, like just spreadable urea or spreadable ammonium sulfate, those are the types of fillers that I'll use. If you're talking about spray grade soluble materials, then no, I won't talk about filler in those cases. Hope that answers your question, Chuck. Okay. How is fertilizer cost fairly compared? As I mentioned, cost per ton. These are real examples, okay? Real fertilizer costs and real examples of why you should consider one method of comparing costs versus the other. When you compare cost per ton, I want to point out very clearly that the natural organics, and this will happen almost every time, the natural organics on the cost per ton will be much less expensive. They're going to vary anywhere between $300 and $500 or $600 a ton. Now, you can get like things like, I'll leave the brand names out of it, but there's other natural organic products that are extremely expensive per ton, $1,400, $1,500 a ton for some types of natural organic materials. It's not always the case, but in many cases, the natural organics will be the least expensive per ton. Whereas the reactive products like polyon, methylene urea, or polyon, the reactive products like methylene urea, urea formaldehyde, and the coated products like polyon duration and these things will be the most expensive per ton. This is generally the case when you price it per ton. But when you price it per pound of nitrogen, and these are real prices, real dollars and cents that I don't know, I don't have the publication here, but these are real dollars that I actually published in Hort Tech. When you price it on a price per pound of nitrogen, it flip-flops. The natural organics that were the least expensive per ton are now 6 to 7 to high as maybe 10 times more expensive than the least expensive one, in this case is urea. So over here, when you're pricing on pounds of cost per ton, urea is sort of in the middle here. Okay, that's $600 a ton. But when you price it per pound of N, urea drops way down to the bottom. Very, very much less expensive. Very much less. It's an oxymoron, but it's less expensive than any other nitrogen source on a price per pound of nitrogen. XCU, this coated sulfur coat right here, is the least expensive slow release on a cost per pound of nitrogen, but it's the third least expensive slow release if you do it on price per ton, because you got biosolids and milorganite below it on price per ton. So the price per pound of N is going to be the way that we're going to end up leaning on heavily, and it's what I would recommend you lean on heavily when it comes to comparing your nitrogen. What is apples to apples? The argument from some manufacturers and some salesmen is that yes, this is correct. The cost per ton and cost per pound of nitrogen is true, but the nitrogen that's in this urea here is going to result in a different turfgrass response than the nitrogen that's in, say, urea formaldehyde or methylene urea down here. The response is not the same. In other words, the pounds of nitrogen are not equal. Therefore, we should consider the response of the turfgrass to these nitrogen sources if we're going to look at a fair comparison. And many of the listeners that have listened to the channel for a while know where I'm going with this. I've already presented that paper months and months ago. This is a presentation that I use at some meetings, and you'll see some of the same data in this presentation. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to say the nitrogen sources aren't the same, which they're not the same, okay, but if you're going to say the turfgrass response to these nitrogen sources vary greatly, and you need to consider that, then we need to look at cost per day of acceptable turf. That would give us a fair comparison of these nitrogen sources. But the problem is we just don't really have a whole lot of data on that. Like I said, I only know of one publication that's ever done that. And so we don't have anything. And that ambiguity, or the ignorance in the literature, the lack of knowledge we have in the literature, is ripe picking grounds for BS artists to come in and start spewing a bunch of nonsense on marketing sheets. Oh, this slow release material lasts 90 days, and then the urea is soluble. It's not going to last 90 days. And so therefore the cost of this slow release material is actually less expensive because the turfgrass response is going to be longer. They can just say these things. They have zero evidence to support it. None. There's no evidence to support that claim. They're just making assertions. And it's because there's an open, fertile ground, pardon the pun, for BSRs to step right in and convince you that what they're saying is true and get some more of your money. That's what they're trying to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, nothing wrong with getting money, but to do so in a fair way, in an honest way, is oftentimes what's lacking. Okay. So we want as scientists to step into that void of knowledge and see what's there. And that's what I did. And that's how I'm going to explain here real quick how we do that. So how is the cost per day of acceptable turfs determined? Well, if you have the fertilizer price, which we can easily get, you just need to divide it by the days of acceptable turf grass. It can be turf grass greater than 6 or greater than 7 or greater than 8, whatever acceptable limit you have. Whatever your limit is, you need to be able to have data on that. And then you just divide the two and you come up with cost per days of acceptability. That's what it is. And so, for example, if urea costs 90 cents for a pound of nitrogen and it lasts 60 days, then it would be $0.015. That's what it would cost per day of acceptable turf grass. If these are just hypothetical, but if that's what it was, that's what you found, and this is the way you can do it. But the problem is, someone's got to go out and actually run these numbers and run this study to see how long urea actually results in acceptable turf grass. That takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. All right. So what I mean by acceptable turf grass is generally we say 6 is acceptable. And so when I say the length of acceptable, we're going to start counting. On the screen here, we have turf quality, and then we have months of the year. And this is just a hypothetical curve that I've created where turf quality is unacceptable at some point, and then we apply nitrogen, say here, at day 1, and then the quality of the turf goes up above acceptable limits, and it stays up above acceptable limits for some period of time, and then goes back down. We apply more nitrogen, and it goes up and down. This is the longevity of response, okay? You can use 6, you can use 7, you can use 8. I've sometimes heard that, well, you're talking about acceptable turf grass. My acceptable limit is different. I want my lawn to be perfect all the time. Well, then that's your acceptable limit. 9 would be your limit, which is unrealistic. I mean, a flawless turf grass almost never exists. But maybe 8. Maybe 8 is your limit. Then put the number at 8. It's whatever acceptable limit that you have. Okay. But the problem with this is that some nitrogen sources can result in unacceptable turf grass, but others can result in acceptable turf grass, but the turf grass quality can be much greater. In other words, the curve can go up from 6 to all the way up to 8 or 9, whereas other nitrogen sources might only go up to 7. And that's where we want to look at the area under the curve. And so that nullifies any argument about, well, you're only setting the limit at 6. And if you only set the limit at 6 and my limit's at 7, then this is irrelevant. Well, true, if I only use longevity, but I'm using also the days, the quality days, which is a two-dimensional metric, the longevity and the magnitude of response. And that, as we find out later, that actually is a more valid approach. We do see differences in that approach more than we do just in longevity, but it's immensely difficult to get those data. But it can be done if you so desire to do it, okay? So here's an example of real data that I haven't actually shown these data on my channel. These are the data from which the publication was generated. And on the screen here, we show January 1 all the way through the end of the year in December, and we show there's a line graph, turf qualities on the y-axis, and then the months are on the x-axis. And these line graphs go up above quality limits and then down below the 6 is the acceptable limit. And it has the actual longevity of the application. So we did 3 applications, 3 4-month applications. And we have the lines include untreated turf grass, urea, ammonium sulfate, Uflex, XCU, Polyon 42, Polyworks, duration 90, biosolid mill organite, urea formaldehyde, and methylene urea. A very big study we did on years ago in Fort Lauderdale. And basically what I want to point out here is that when you apply the nitrogen, the quality is going to go up from almost every nitrogen source. And then at some point from every nitrogen source, it's going to go down below this limit. Okay. And then it's going to go back up when you hit the next application, and then it's going to go back down at some point. Okay. And up and down. This is sort of the roller coaster that we go on. And they differ. The turf grass response to these nitrogen sources, without question, do differ. Some of the nitrogen sources respond much quicker than others. Some nitrogen sources, the magnitude of response is much greater than others. But we got to go out and do it. We got to figure out, which ones are resulting in what response. We don't know. Okay. So these are real data that that I haven't shown yet. So anyway. Okay, so by doing that, so by doing this, what happens is when the quality goes above 6, we start counting the days. And we keep counting the days until the quality goes down below 6. And again, pick 7 if you want to. I don't care what you pick. Count the number of days above 7 and then stop counting when it goes below 7 and so forth. And then we come up with the days of acceptable turf grass. We got to find some way to do that. And that's the way I did it. So now that we do have that, we do have the fertilizer price. We just get that from our salesman. And now we do have the days of turf quality greater than 6, or again, greater than whatever threshold you want to put on it. And then now we can come up with the actual days of acceptable turf grass. And when we do that, we find that, and these, I'm going to show the next graphs I haven't actually shown yet on the channel. I'm going to show what happened. The publication has things merged or pulled together because there was no interaction between locations. But this figure, I'm going to show what 1 pound happened in South Florida and what happened with 2 pounds of nitrogen in South Florida. What happened at 1 pound in North Florida, what happens at 2 pounds in North Florida. So that we can sort of put to bed any argument there could exist about the rate wasn't right or the location wasn't right and so forth. And by the way, this was conducted on native soil, Bermuda grass growing on native soil. I have to look at the publication. I think this was Celebration Bermuda, but I have to go back and look at the publication. I don't recall. But this wasn't on a bent grass green. There's been a couple of arguments that are unbelievably bad arguments online, saying you should just ignore some of the information that is being provided by academicians, unless it was performed on unless it was your working on a bent grass putting green, because all the academicians are publishing data, and the nutrient application programs are only relevant to bent grass putting greens because that's all they work on. That's completely false. I don't even know if I've ever published any work on bent grass putting greens. Okay. This is on Bermuda grass on native soil. And I'm going to show another slide that's on St. Augustine grass on native soil. And you can show many, many other publications. You can go back on the channel and look at the potassium papers, and I show the turf grass that it was conducted on. Some of them were on bent grass. Some of them weren't. So when you hear someone say, well, if it's on bent grass, unless it was on bent grass putting greens, you should just ignore basically what the academicians are saying. That's completely not true. And that's probably being communicated by someone who is just ignorant to how research is conducted and probably doesn't bother actually reading the research. Because if they read the research, they would read the materials and methods and know exactly what turf grass it was conducted on. And they would know that this wasn't on bent grass putting green. Sorry, getting on a tangent here, but this was on Bermuda grass on native soil. And we look at South Florida, 1 pound of nitrogen every 4 months. The nitrogen sources that were the least expensive were urea and XCU. The urea being the least expensive soluble, XCU being the least expensive slow release, and biosolids and milorganite were the most expensive. So you'll notice this doesn't differ that much from the comparison of nitrogen sources and cost per pound of nitrogen. It says it's the natural organics were the most expensive cost per pound of N. Urea and XCU tend to be the least expensive soluble and slow release source on cost per pound of N as well. Okay, and that's at 1 pound of nitrogen every 4 months. But the argument can be made, some of these slow release materials, particularly the slower materials like polymer 42, duration 90, they're not intended to be applied at 1 pound. They need a higher rate because they're so slow. They need a little bit more nitrogen being released on a daily basis. And 1 pound of nitrogen isn't going to provide that. They need to be applied at 2 pounds, which I'm not going to argue that. So, but I did do it at 2 pounds. And when I did do it at 2 pounds, you see the same exact result where you have urea being the least expensive soluble by far, and XCU, which is a sulfur-coated urea, being the least expensive slow release by far. Many percentage of points less expensive than the reacted and the coated ones. And once again, the natural organics are the most expensive by far, many like 5 or 6 fold greater than the urea at 2 pounds. So this argument about the slow release materials are good, but they really, to shine, need to be applied at higher rates, does not hold water, at least according to these data, at 2 pounds in South Florida. But let's go to North Florida. When we do 1 pound in North Florida, again, urea is the least expensive soluble, and XCU is the least expensive slow release. And again, natural organics are the most expensive. All right. When we go to North Florida and use 2 pounds of nitrogen, again, it's the same result. Urea and XCU are the least expensive soluble and slow release materials, and the natural organics are the most expensive slow release materials. Full stop, slow release and soluble. Okay. So, at least under the conditions of this study, there's not a lot of evidence. There's no evidence to support this idea that you need to be applying higher rates of these slow release materials in order for them to cost less money. You might have perfectly good turf with them. There's no question. All of these nitrogen sources resulted in acceptable turf grass. I want to make sure that's clear. It's just the slow release materials such as the polymer coats and the natural organics just cost more to do it. That's it. All right. And by the way, this was published in here's a citation down here. So it's not just me saying this. This is actual data that you can go look up. Okay, so balancing fertilizer costs using turfgrass response. The purchase price cost per pound of N, which is what I just put up earlier. This is times greater than urea. So urea is not even on this chart because I'm comparing everything to urea. And so, for example, XCU is about 1.5 times more expensive than urea. And milorganite is about 6 times more expensive than urea if you just do it on purchase price per pound of nitrogen. When you compare the longevity, when you add that in, it doesn't really change anything other than it costs a little more money for milorganite if you do it on a cost per longevity of turf response. And if you add in that metric, the area under the curve, longevity and magnitude, it doesn't change anything in terms of reducing the cost. It doesn't reduce the cost of these slow release materials. If anything, it just increases the cost of materials such as methylene urea formaldehyde, biosolids, and milorganite. So we don't see hardly any meat on that bone about, oh, you should include the longevity in turf response because these solar materials are going to last so much longer that the cost will offset. We don't see anything with regard to that, at least in this study. Okay. So now we're going to go to a prior study conducted on St. Augustine grass on native soil, not on bent grass, not on a bent grass putting green, just so we're 100% clear here. Okay. There's a prior study. This was not published. This was conducted by me in Citra, Florida. And I used NatureSafe and sewage sludge and milorganite and all these other things. Okay. Polyon and a couple polymer coated products you've probably never heard of, like R-Coat and Surf Coat and things like that, as well as urea and XCU. And that's on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have cost per day, basically. Cost per 1,000 square feet per day. And again, you see the natural organics and the sludges be the most expensive. And once again, you see the sulfur coat and the urea being the least expensive on Bermuda grass and on St. Augustine grass. Okay. Granted, that wasn't published, but it was conducted by myself. So in general, that was on nitrogen sources. So when it comes to what nitrogen sources we should be including in our granular fertilizer, I felt a compelling argument to include urea as your soluble source, unless you have some other desired effect on pH or you have a sulfate deficiency, in which case you might want to consider ammonium sulfate, because ammonium sulfate was comparable to many of the other slow release materials. Ammonium sulfate was less expensive than them. So if you need to reduce the pH or you have a sulfate deficiency, ammonium sulfate could be an option rather than urea. And if you have the need or the desire to use slow release materials, then sulfur coated urea has consistently resulted in that product being the least expensive slow release material per cost per pound of N and cost per day of response if you want to go down those roads. Now let's talk about phosphorus and potassium. So we're going to talk about what phosphorus and potassium sources you should consider, or when we're going to be blending fertilizer. Well, what phosphorus do I need? What potassium is the most efficient? This is sort of the next couple of slides. When we talk about phosphorus and potassium, generally the form of soluble phosphorus is not that significant when it comes to turfgrass response. Generally, turfgrass will respond similarly to most soluble P sources. Diammonium phosphate and concentrated superphosphate are normally the least expensive. And the reason I say these things, when I say the form of soluble P is not that significant, is because generally we don't see responses to phosphorus at all unless the turfgrass is exhibiting a phosphorus deficiency. We don't see a beneficial result from applying phosphorus. So generally we'll see about the same thing happen. When you have a phosphorus deficiency and you see the the symptoms of phosphorus deficiency in the turf grass, and you apply a phosphorus source, generally you're going to see the same response from phosphorus sources just based upon its solubility. If you have a phosphorus source that's extremely insoluble versus one that's very soluble, you probably see one quicker with a soluble P source, okay? But generally, concentrated superphosphate, diammonium phosphate are going to give you the response that you're looking for when it comes to alleviating phosphorus deficiency symptoms. Okay, so I wouldn't argue or get lost in, I got to get the least expensive phosphorus source, and what is it? The least expensive is DAP and concentrated superphosphate. But in terms of turfgrass response, the argument is moot, okay? When it comes to potassium sources, again, generally the form of soluble K is not significant. The only thing to be aware of is the burn potential. Potassium sources are well known to burn turfgrass if applied incorrectly. Sulfate of potash has the lowest burn potential. Potassium chloride, muriate of potash, is the least expensive potassium source in almost every case, but it has the greatest burn potential. So if you're looking to see a turfgrass response to applying potassium, good luck. You probably will never observe that. You probably will never see a bona fide turfgrass response to applied potassium, unless it's a negative response, which I'm showing on the channel during the potassium month. There were 6 or 7 papers I showed that the application of potassium to turfgrass growing on potassium sufficient soils increases the risk of disease. If you're going to see a turfgrass response to applied potassium, it's going to be on turfgrass grown on deficient potassium soils. But even then, it's not easy to see a potassium response. But if you do, the source that I would choose would be relative to my risk tolerance of burn. If you don't really care about the burn potential or whatever, then just use muriate of potash. Okay, it's the least expensive source. But if your risk tolerance is very low for burn, then you need to go with some of the least risk of burn, which would be sulfate of potash. Okay. Other than that, the turfgrass response to the K itself the difference is almost negligible. Okay. In P and K summary, nitrogen, all sources can result in acceptable turf, high quality turf. I have yet to see a nitrogen source that will not result in a high quality turfgrass as long as you apply it at the correct way, the correct rate, and water it in. You follow the BMPs. Any nitrogen source will pretty much do it. The least expensive is urea and sulfur-coated urea, so these are the ones that you would probably want to rely on or at least start with when it comes to blending your fertilizer. Phosphorus sources are relatively insignificant. I don't see enough there to really lean on one versus the other. There can be an argument made, I get it, but it's almost insignificant. So just use the least expensive, which tends to be concentrated superphosphate or diammonium phosphate. Potassium sources, again, it's relatively insignificant except for the burn potential. And the least expensive is muriate of potash, and the lowest burn is sulfate of potash. And I know there's a difference with sulfate of potash magnesia when it comes to the pounds and versus the pounds of K versus the pounds of material, but I'm going with lowest burn as a sulfate of potash for now. Okay? So these are the sources that you'd sort of want to direct your attention to first if you're looking to develop the most efficient fertilizer or the least expense, the most gain in return for the expense that you paid. If you're looking for that approach, these are the ones that I would lean on, with the understanding that there are certain areas that can be adjusted based upon your specific site needs. But if you start with this and then only make changes when you have a good reason, you'll most likely be very close to a very efficient blend. Okay, other nutritional components. And this is sort of the basic summation of the next couple of maybe 20 minutes is you probably don't need to apply much anything else. Very little. There's a couple little tweaks here and there, but for the most part, I wouldn't get overly concerned about throwing out a bunch of other materials other than nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There can be obviously situations where that wouldn't hold true. But for the most part, I wouldn't get overly concerned about this unless you have a good reason to include other components. These are things like iron. This is a study that I conducted back in, 2019, where I looked at all these 11 soils and 12 soils. And again, this is not a bent grass putting green. This was on 11 different soils around the United States. Many of the locations, the soils were pulled from turf grass, native soil turf grasses, not a bent grass putting green. So, in these locations, the pH is varied from 5.1 to 7.9 from Mississippi to Florida, to Oklahoma, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Colorado, New Mexico. And you can see the various Malic 3 iron extracted levels based upon the pH. And people say, well, the higher pH, you're going to have less iron available. Lower pH, you're going to have more iron available. And you can kind of see a little bit of that here, where the 5.1, 5.3 have 300 and 100. And the higher ones, 7.8 and 7.9, have 50 and 30 Malic 3. That in general, it's sort of okay to think of it like that. But you'll see here in Sumter, South Carolina, 5.7 has 92. And you'll see Columbus, Ohio, 7.4 has 157. So it's not always the case that low pH soils have high iron and high pH soils have low iron. Generally, it's probably a good assumption. But you can't just assume that, oh, my pH is 7, so I have no iron and I need to go start throwing out iron. That's not always the case, or vice versa. All right. Regardless of soil, non-chelated iron becomes insoluble with 1 hour. This will look familiar to any of the viewers of the channel. This was published in Agronomy Journal 2019. I'm looking at the x-axis with a variety of iron sources and the y-axis being soluble iron as a percent of applied. After 1 hour, all of these iron sources, with the exception of EDTA, DTPA, and EDDHA, and IDHA, which is an organic chelate, had very little there, but there was a little bit. Iron citrate, polysaccharide, iron sulfate, iron glucoheptanate, iron humate, iron oxide, and non-treated, they all had the same iron content as the non-treated soil. And this was in 11 soils, guys and gals. These 3 chelates, after 1 hour, had, 50, 60% of their iron remained soluble after 1 hour. After 3 weeks, EDDHA went down to about 25% soluble iron. So there was still a little bit of soluble iron from EDDHA 3 weeks after, 8% from DTPA, so very, very little. 92% was already insoluble at 3 weeks. And those were really the only 2. EDTA had a little bit of solubility, probably 95, 96% of that iron in EDTA was already oxidized out and unavailable. But the point here is that iron sources that we generally will apply in granular fertilizer are completely useless, even if it's iron sulfate, which is soluble, which stains concrete. When you apply it to the soil, it'll stain the soil. It oxidizes. Okay, and they're not useful. So we're talking about efficient fertilizer blending. If you have iron in your efficient fertilizer, unless it's EDDHA, which I don't think they make a granular EDDHA, and even if it is in there, you need to get the rate high enough to see a response. Unless it's EDDHA or DTPA or potentially EDTA, depending on the soil pH, any other iron source is completely wasted. It's useless. They're going to become, we forget the turf for a second. There's none soluble in the soil at all, full stop, at an hour. So you don't even get to your next lawn, your next account, and whatever iron you applied on that lawn that you left is already insoluble. It's already oxidized into iron oxide. So there's zero chance the turf grass is going to take it up at that point. All right. And you'll see this iron, on the screen I'm showing iron staining on concrete, and this could be a pool deck. This could be any surface. This is a sidewalk here. It stains soil. This is an open canopy turf that I was growing in at Fort Lauderdale. This is the little brown spots on this soil are iron stains. It'll stain the turf if it sits on the turf surface itself. You'll see black spots everywhere, and you'll want to go out and throw in fungicide because you think you got disease, but in reality, it's just the iron sulfate that was sitting on top of the canopy. This is latitude 36. You'll see it on Tiff Tough. You see it on any turf grass that's tight. 2 points here. On tight turf, the granule may remain on the canopy. If it remains on the canopy, it's going to leave a little black circle. At 6% iron and 300 pounds per acre, the spread rate is not even uniform anyway. 6% iron. So imagine you had 2% manganese or 2% magnesium. All these little black dots on the screen, which looks like leopard spots, that's from iron at 6%. So imagine if you're trying to say, okay, I get it, Travis, I'm not going to apply iron. I'm going to use magnesium or manganese. Well, if you put it in at 2% or 3% or as high as 6%, you're still going to have this particle distribution on your turf grass. And the question is whether or not you would see any value in that poor of a uniformity or a distribution across your turf. I doubt you would, but that's what you would see. And here's a close-up of this fertilizer granule right here in the middle of this dark black spot. on one of those turf grasses that I had down in Fort Lauderdale. Tiff Eagle, these are tight mode grasses, putting green grasses where you see iron sulfate have a uniform color response, whereas the same amount of iron from granular iron has a splotchy appearance. And again, tight mode turf grass and granular iron are not compatible. They don't like each other. You'll see this all the time. When you spray out iron, you see a response. You see a uniform response. Here is some Princess Bermuda on native soil, not bent grass putting greens. You see foliar iron being sprayed out. You see these green rectangles all over the place, and the other ones that you don't see, other turf grass squares that you don't see any green square, those also received iron. They just received it as granular iron. So the foliar iron is the way to go. If you choose to apply iron, spray it, don't spread it. So the point there is exactly what I said. I haven't yet to come across a good reason to include iron in a granular fertilizer. You should just essentially exclude it completely. That'll save you money. Okay, we've done a lot of work with that, and I have yet to see much evidence at all to support the use of granular iron. Let's go to manganese. So now we're on manganese. Percent manganese remaining soluble in soils. And now we have an x-axis that has time from 1 hour to 3 weeks. On the y-axis, we have soluble manganese, and we're going to be looking at manganese sulfate and manganese glucoheptanate. And I've been listening to a couple podcasts that I find comical. And on there, they talk sometimes about glucoheptanate or gluconate and these other chelation sources and how they can be useful. The only value that I've seen in terms of using a chelate, in terms of manganese, for example, is really in the actual manufacturing of the solution in a tank or in a jug to keep it soluble so that you can actually get it out of the spray boom or spray nozzles. If there's value there, then it may be worth paying for, okay? But in terms of turf response and soil solubility, we've done work with this, and I don't see hardly any value in that at all. And this was published in Soil Science Scientific American Journal in 2016. And if you're going to pay for manganese glucoheptanate, my point is, I'm expecting to get something in return for it relative to manganese sulfate, because manganese glucoheptanate costs more. And when we see this, we see manganese sulfate at 1 hour remain about 80% soluble. 4 days, 4 hours, about 80% soluble. 24 hours, about 70% soluble. And then it goes down slowly to about 3 weeks, remaining about 40% soluble at 3 weeks. So manganese is like iron in that it will oxidize out of solution, but it's not the same rate as iron. It takes a little longer for manganese to become unavailable for plant uptake than iron. Okay, so manganese sulfate, if applied, will oxidize, but some of it will still remain available, or remain soluble, I should say, in the soil solution. But when we apply a manganese chelate, which being glucoheptanate in this case, do we see any benefit? No, we don't. Glucoheptanate is not a soil chelate. There's not any evidence in the literature. I've published 2 or 3 papers on this, and I've never seen any data to convince me that I should pay more money for glucoheptanate because I'm trying to get more nutrients soluble in the solution, soluble in the soil, and uptake by the plant. I've never seen any of that. Like I said, there may be value in manufacturing and making the product. If you're going to put it in with a bunch of other metals, there may be value in that. I'm not a solution chemist. But when it comes to the soil and the plant, I have yet to see any value, any good reason at all to pay more money for glucoheptanate than for manganese sulfate. And right here is some data. This is, you can read this publication. This is not me saying this. This is actually published in Soil Science Scientific American Journal, one of our top tier journals. Here's an example of a manganese response. I've since sort of backed off on this a little bit because I didn't include a sulfate check. This could be I'm showing Tiff Eagle putting greens down in South Florida, and you see a green rectangle from manganese sulfate application. This actually could be a sulfate response as well. I didn't include a sulfate check, so I can't say for sure. But in any case, I applied manganese sulfate, and you saw a green rectangle show up compared to not applying manganese sulfate. Let's talk about magnesium. With magnesium, it's a little different. Magnesium remains soluble in soils. The problem is magnesium remains soluble in soils. It's soluble. It's out there, okay? There are many soils have plenty of magnesium in them. Very rarely do we come across a soil so deficient in magnesium that the chances of seeing a turfgrass response to applying magnesium is high. It's very rare we see that. And here's an example. This is again published in Agronomy Journal in 2019. Generally speaking, we first of all, we don't have really strong, convincing evidence to say your magnesium level should be X from a Malic 3 extract. We don't have strong evidence for that. But there is, if you can parse through the literature and find some general numbers, and they tend to be in the teens, okay? Sometimes they'll float up in the 30s, where the authors will say, our magnesium was 30, and we didn't see any response, or our magnesium was 20 and we didn't see a response, so it would need to be below that. So I'm saying that to say this: I put the range somewhere between 20 and 40 parts per million magnesium on a Malic 3. Somewhere in that range is probably a little too low. You probably want to start considering the use of the application of magnesium, or at least looking for magnesium deficiencies in turfgrass when you get down that low. But it's probably lower, but we don't know for sure. But if it's 20 to 40, let's say it's 50, and you look at all these soils from Nebraska to New Mexico to Oklahoma to Alabama to Florida, look at the Malic 3 magnesium on all these. 400, 300, 300, 300, 200, 150. There was only one soil down where my research was, which was beach sand, where our Malic 3 magnesium was probably lower than the acceptable limit, which is probably around 30 or 40 parts per million Malic 3 magnesium, something like that. Could be as low as 20. And all the other ones were twice that high or more. Many of them were 10, some of them were 10 times greater than the minimum, 400 and 300. So we just don't usually see magnesium get so low that we probably would want to apply magnesium with our granular fertilizer. You could. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not likely. It's going to remain soluble, as you'll see on the next slide, but you just don't see much in the soil low enough to warrant its application. Okay? So here you see soluble magnesium, again, magnesium sulfate and magnesium glucoheptanate, 1 hour to 3 weeks out, published in Soil Science Society of America Journal. Percent of applied, we see no difference between these two magnesium sources. And magnesium, you'll notice, does not taper off at the end. It doesn't taper off at the end. Magnesium is not oxidizing at the same rate as iron or manganese in soils. It remains soluble. A lot of it dropped down to about 75% solubility, or of the percent of applied, about 75% remains soluble. Okay, so about 25% oxidized out, but it remained pretty steady. 3 weeks out, it's still 75% soluble. So you can apply magnesium if you want to, and it's going to remain soluble. You probably won't see a response because it's soluble in the soil. It's in the soil already. And you don't see any value to applying glucoheptanate once again. The glucoheptanate did not increase the solubility of magnesium in these soils. Okay? Now, let's go to the take-home message with manganese and magnesium. Manganese will remain partially soluble in most soils, partially soluble. Turfgrass response to manganese may occur on putting greens, but it's rare on native soils. Now, there is a bona fide response to manganese in the literature, beneficial response, there's no question. 1979, I think it was. There's probably been others since then. It can happen. Okay. So manganese, it is possible to see a response from manganese. It's not that common, but it can happen. So I'm not going to rule it out as an option for granular fertilizer. So manganese may be applied in granular foliar fertilizers, is what I say right here. I'm not saying don't apply it. I'm not saying only apply nitrogen. I'm saying only apply elements that you have a good reason to apply. And here we see, as the evidence I just showed you, that it is possible to see a response to manganese. Manganese will remain sparingly soluble in the soil. So if you diagnose yourself, or you see a soil test low enough, and you see a manganese deficiency in your turfgrass, then it is valid to include manganese in your granular fertilizer. And that's what I say here. What about magnesium? Take-home message. Magnesium, in normal native soils, magnesium is almost never required. Almost never. Turfgrass response to magnesium is uncommon. We've done a lot of work. I've probably done 3 or 4 studies with magnesium in several different locations, dozens and dozens and dozens of ratings, probably 100 ratings or more. And I did see one rating date in one location of one study have a magnesium response. There was a greater quality following the application of magnesium. But that was one out of maybe 100 rating dates. So it's not impossible. It's just very unlikely that you'd ever see a response to applying magnesium unless your location is known to be magnesium deficient. Magnesium will remain soluble and may be applied in a granular or foliar fertilizer. Like I said the other day, if you want Tic Tacs in your fertilizer, I'll put Tic Tacs in your fertilizer. I'm letting you know it's probably not going to be beneficial to you. I'm letting you know it's going to cost you more money. But as a salesman, my conscience would be clear. And if that's what you want to do, put magnesium in there. It's probably not going to do anything. The sulfate has a better chance of doing anything than magnesium does. But if you want to put it in, I'll put it in. Okay. I'm not going to argue with you. I just want to let you know it's probably not going to be useful to you. Okay. Let's talk about sulfate real briefly here. Sulfate sulfur. Okay. If you want to know what a sulfate sulfur response looks like, it looks exactly like a nitrogen response. Up here in the top left-hand corner, you'll see urea applied, and you'll see some greening, not much. And then you'll see these other green, really, really bright green squares. This was on Kentucky bluegrass here in Lexington. And all these had sulfate in them. Some of them had magnesium, some of them had urea. I mean, there's all these different combinations, but the only thing that was common was that they all had sulfate. So I went out and did a study, and I've determined that, in fact, it was a sulfate response. This is how you determine it's a sulfate response, not conducted on bent grass putting greens, conducted on Kentucky bluegrass native soil. This is how you do it. This is how your research is conducted in reality. If I went out with just this square and I saw a green square, you're going to go, oh, there was a potassium response because you put out potassium sulfate. Okay. I've put out potassium sulfate and I saw a response. I've seen a response. I put out potassium sulfate. I saw a response. I don't have much doubt. I don't have much doubt that you probably did. But I have a great deal of skepticism that it was actually from potassium. Okay. It was probably from sulfate. And the only way you're going to know that is if you put out the same amount of potassium as potassium chloride or potassium whatever, something without sulfate. And that's what this bottom square here. They see a bright green rectangle with sulfate of potash and a rectangle consistent with the non-treated turf grass when I use potassium chloride. Okay. So this is how we do research. We don't guess. We go out there and we actually get the right controls and the right treatments, the right comparisons, and we actually figure out what's going on here. And indeed, it was sulfur. Now, how do we actually determine what critical limits are? Now, some of you who have counseled with me on Calendly, calendly.com/TravisShaddox, if you're looking for individual consultation, I've talked a lot about cliffs, nutritional cliffs, meaning at some point your soil nutritional level, if you're Malic-3 extractant or whatever, it could be Olsen extractant, whatever soil extractant you're using, you're going to eventually come to a cliff if it gets down low enough. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't take much more over that cliff and you're going to drop drastically down. The quality of your turf grass is going to decline rapidly. It's not subtle. It's going to decline rapidly. Why do I say that? Because when we go out and do the work, this is yet to be published, but this is what I'm talking about, a cliff. Going along here, turf grass quality is fine. Turf grass quality is fine. Malic-3 sulfur at 10, 9, 8, 7, everything's fine. And then you see this drop off of quality down to 4 very rapidly once the sulfate sulfur gets down into single digits, essentially. They're on around 7, 6, 7, something like that. You see a very, very sharp decline in turf quality. That's the cliff I'm talking about. The same cliff exists very likely with phosphorus. In fact, I showed a paper that showed that with phosphorus. There's a cliff with potassium. There's a cliff with any of these elements. It doesn't take much. You either have enough or you don't. And the line between having enough and not having enough is extremely steep. Okay, it's a cliff. So how do we figure out the minimums? You run a regression on these data. You run a regression. You come up with an equation and you can calculate. In the fall, I determined that the sulfate sulfur level for Malic-3 was about 7.2. Well, it changed in the spring a little bit. It was actually 4.2. The cliff was a little lower in the spring, so it can vary a little bit based on seasons, based on times of year and so forth. But this is how we do proper research. How do we determine how much we actually apply when it's low? This is how research is conducted. This is a calibration. We go out with no sulfate sulfur. We go out with 3 pounds, 7 pounds, 10 pounds, 14 pounds, and we figure out which one of these rates is actually going to result in acceptable turf grass. Here's the acceptable limit 6 right here, and here's 6 right over here, okay? Well, that's not really straight, but see my point. And we go out. Well, 0 wasn't enough. Well, 3 pounds wasn't enough. And this year, 7 pounds was enough in the fall. Oops, in the fall right here, 7 pounds was enough. But look, in the spring, we see that 0 wasn't enough, 3 wasn't enough, but the 7 pounds was enough. Okay? So it can change based upon the season, based upon the initial levels of nutrient in the soil. But this is how we figure out rates. When you do these soil samples and they say you're low on this and therefore you should apply X amount, what I've said for years is that how do you know? Was there a calibration done? Because I suspect there wasn't. Because I know how hard it is to go out and do this calibration. This is a calibration on the screen that I conducted. And so now I have a not great amount of confidence, but I do have a fair amount of confidence that on Kentucky bluegrass low in sulfate sulfur, I can recommend, probably 10 pounds of sulfate sulfur per acre, something like that, or more if you want to be safe. But something around that is going to give you the response that you're looking for, alleviating your sulfate deficiency. Now, I know that because I've done the calibration. When you see these home tests that they have a little bead in them and they say, I'm going to come back to this in soil testing, by the way. They have a little bead in it and say, okay, you're low in potassium and you need to apply this much potassium. My question is, one, was there a correlation done on that bead, which is what this screen is right here? This is a correlation that I conducted. Was there such a thing conducted using that bead on that particular element? And then they say you should apply X, you should buy this product and apply so many pounds of this product. Then the question is, okay, did you do a calibration? Because this is a calibration. Okay, they don't necessarily have to publish it. In other words, if it's a private company, there's no law or rule saying they have to publish those data. Okay, but I'm not going to be convinced unless I see it in a published form, because they can just make up anything. Like, so yeah, we did it. And then it's private data. We did it. We don't need to show you. That's true. They don't need to show me. That's right. They don't. But I don't have to believe them. And I'm not going to believe them until I actually see evidence. And this is on the screen is evidence to support the use of a Mehlich 3 soil test for sulfate sulfur, and then support the recommendation to apply a certain amount of sulfate sulfur. That's how it's done. Granular non-NPK nutrients. Evidence supports manganese, magnesium, and sulfate sulfur. Evidence does not support iron, boron, zinc, calcium, copper, molybdenum. There's not much in the literature at all. It's certainly not in the field that applying any of these elements is going to be beneficial to you. So you can essentially eliminate, with the extremely rare situations, like for example, calcium. There's some situations with calcium. I've ran across a couple soil tests lately that have calcium levels in Mehlich 3 in the 200s, very, very low. Some situations might warrant that, but it's extremely rare, so rare to the point that you can just assume you should exclude all these unless you have a good reason to include them. And then when you're looking at manganese and magnesium and sulfate, I would say the same thing. I would just not even use these unless you have a good reason. The reason is probably better with manganese, magnesium, and sulfate than it is with any of these micronutrients over here. Well, calcium is a macronutrient, but you see what I'm getting at. Which materials should you consider for granular nutrition? Which materials? There's strong evidence for NP and K, marginal evidence for magnesium, manganese, and sulfate sulfur, and there's strong evidence against calcium and zinc and boron and copper and molybdenum and all these other things. Okay. Fertilizer ratios. Let's get into ratios real quick. When I'm talking about a ratio of 15:5:15 is a 3:1:3 ratio. Just to make sure we're on the same page. There's all sorts of different ratios for turfgrass fertilizers, 1608s and 2404s and 62424s. There's all these different ratios, okay? How do you know what you should be using? The U.S. average N-to-K ratios, according to the GCSAA survey, this is on golf courses, the 2006, 2014, 2022 surveys indicate that on putting greens, it's essentially a 1-to-1 N-to-K, which some of the evidence in the literature would support that. On fairways and roughs, in 2006, we were applying almost a 1-to-1. It was a 1.2 to 1 in 2006 in fairways and roughs. And what I want to point out is that over the years since 2006, there's been a little less potassium being applied. And that's evidenced by this right here. It goes from 1.2 to 1 In 2014, it's 1.3 to 1. In 2022, it was 1.4 to 1. In other words, we're lowering the amount of potassium, or we could be increasing the amount of nitrogen. So we're moving from this 1-to-1 mentality of NK to a more of a 1.5 to 1 or a 2 to 1 NK. Now, in lawn care, ironically enough, in lawn care, we don't see ratios like that common. Usually, it's about a 2 to 1 NK already. There's usually more nitrogen being applied than potassium in most cases in many of the lawn care blends. And we're going to find out that that's actually valid in the way we should be doing it. And the reason I think that a lot of the golf course facilities are applying less potassium is because of the cost. In 2008 and 9, we're looking on the screen here, the cost of potassium, historic cost of potassium per ton. And we see in 2008 and 9, we see this massive spike in the amount of the cost of potassium. And around that time, I was in the industry selling fertilizer, and we saw a lot of people start to actually question, do I need this in my fertilizer? And I was saying, probably not. Probably not. I've been telling it for years, and it only took a hammer of the huge increase in cost for people to actually stop and realize, well, wait a second, do I even need this? Well, I'm paying $800 a ton. Last year I was paying $100 a ton. Now it's $800 a ton. Why do I even need this? Good question. You probably don't need it. And I think that's why we're starting to see a lot more movement towards less and less potassium on roughs and fairways, which is in line with the evidence anyway. So that's good. Okay. Potassium greater than a 2 to 1 does not increase Bermuda grass quality. Remember, this is Bermuda grass on native soil, not a bent grass putting green. Okay? Native soil Bermuda grass. And you see that if you don't apply any potassium at all down in South Florida and you harvest the potassium out of it, you're eventually going to see the quality decline. But if you apply a 2 to 1 NK, you see the quality go right back up to 6 or 7. Perfectly fine. If you apply a 1 to 1 NK, doesn't change. It still stays at the 2 to 1. If you apply a 1 to 2 NK, you're applying a lot of potassium now. You're applying like a 10-0-20. You don't see any increase in quality. And when you look at the tissue potassium, you really don't see much benefit after you get up to about a 2 to 1. So you see no potassium being applied. You're eventually going to see the potassium in the tissue decline over time. All you got to do is apply 2 to 1, 20-0-10, 24-0-12, whatever. And you see the potassium in the tissue go up. You see the quality of the turf grass go up. But if you keep applying more and more and more potassium, you don't really see a concomitant increase in quality, and you don't see a concomitant increase in turf grass tissue K. Maybe a little bit. Statistically, this didn't pull out. This was the same. Pragmatically, you're going from 1.8 to 2% in the tissue. There's a little bit there, not much. And it's irrelevant anyway because you're already seeing the turf grass quality be equivalent. So in other words, you don't need to be wasting more and more money on potassium when you've already gained all the benefit you're going to get out of it with a 2 to 1 NK on Bermuda grass in this case. Potassium, excess potassium can actually result in harm. We've shown that from when we went over potassium for a month, where there's numerous cases where excess potassium can result in disease outbreak. We see this here from Dr. Soldat's work that he has been working on for years up in Wisconsin, and we see the application of potassium resulted in increased microdocium. And again, you go back to the potassium chapter, go look at the playlist and click potassium. You're going to see 6 or 7 papers I went over that showed a very similar response from the application of potassium when you didn't need to, okay? There was some benefit under cold hardiness and cold tolerance and stuff like that. There can be some benefit, but it's usually on low K soils in very specific situations, okay? Efficient NP and K ratios. This is the GCSA BMP template, and you'll see that these ratios of 8 to 1 to 4 are generally recommended. I would say this is a 2 to 1 NK. I would say I would still stay with this, but only when you actually have a phosphorus deficiency. If you don't have a phosphorus deficiency, then don't include the phosphorus. There's no need. So in native soils, an 8-1-4 is generally kind of where we're at. If you need to apply phosphorus, that's where the 1 comes in. If you don't need to apply phosphorus, then just exclude it. Save some money. On greens, there is a little bit of evidence that applying our low-cut turf grass, very low, very stressed turf grass, high-traffic locations and so forth, sand putting greens and so forth, a 1 to 1 NK is probably more appropriate and would help avoid some any risk in reduction in turf grass quality. But don't get hung up in these exact numbers. It doesn't need to be exactly a 2 to 1. It can be, it can vary. Don't get hung up in the exact amount. Just understand that if you do have a potassium deficiency, which I would be skeptical on, I would want to see some evidence for that before I even move forward. But if you did, just apply about half the amount of potassium as you do nitrogen and just apply it regularly with your nitrogen and you're fine. Not a big deal. Summary. The NP and K all-in sources will result in acceptable turf. Urea and XCU are least expensive, and the unique responses to different P and K sources are minimal. Other components such as manganese and magnesium can be included. It's not that common to see a response to them, but they can be included. Sulfate sulfur may be beneficial if it's low, and there's little to no evidence to include anything else in the fertilizer unless you have a good reason. I would exclude it. And the ratios, if you're on tight putting greens or really low-cut turf grass, like if you're cutting 419 less than 500 or something like that, where it's really stressed, you might get a little bit of benefit from a 1-to-1 into K. It's unlikely, but you could. And then everywhere else, it's a 2-to-1 into K. If you need to apply phosphorus, it would be an 8-1-4 ratio with phosphorus, okay? Now we're going to be formulating with multi-nutrient raw materials. Let me go back to me just for a second and take a look at this and see if I can fit this in here or not. Don't know if I can get this all in today. I can't. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm an hour and 15 minutes in. I'm going to stop here. If you want to have any questions, just shoot it in the text real quick, guys. Because to go over these next formulations is going to take me about 30 minutes. So I'll do that on Thursday night. Okay, so Thursday night we'll be formulating with multi-nutrient raw materials. It is logical. I mean, you can follow the math. Everything makes sense. You're probably going to go, yeah, duh. I mean, we could have done this on our own. But if you haven't seen it, you can get lost. You have to account for a lot of other elements. So when you apply, let's say you applied DAP and you applied the phosphorus with DAP, well, you have to account for the nitrogen that was also applied and so forth. That's kind of how it works. But let me hold off on this because I don't want to rush it, and I don't think I can get through this in less than, say, 20 or 30 minutes. So let me hold off on that for Thursday night. Okay, guys and gals, I appreciate everybody's time. So Thursday night at 9 p.m. I'll be on, and I'll do multi-nutrient raw material formulations. I was going to do some comments, but now I won't because I have this as well as one other topic, and the topic came up earlier, I think it was from Chuck, about filler. So we're going to be formulating with raw materials. We're going to be formulating with different types of filler, and I think I'll sum everything up and wrap everything up with formulation on Thursday night at the end, where I'll show you how to formulate the whole shebang with no filler at all. There's two methods that I would recommend you follow: overformulation and then adjustment of the blend nitrogen sources such that there is no filler. So that's what we'll plan on doing on Thursday night then. Okay. Sorry, fellas, if you got the calculators out and you wanted to do a lot of math today. I know how much you probably enjoy doing a bunch of math, but we'll do that on Thursday night. Okay. All right, guys, I'm going to leave you with, let's see. I can't remember what I got at the music at the end, but I'll see you on Thursday night. Have a great day. Have a great week. It is hot here in Lexington. Stay cool. Stay hydrated. Be safe. See you on Thursday night, guys.